guys, tonight we are going to drift back into the echoing chambers of medieval Europe, where crowns glittered in candlelight and kings sat on thrones, heavy with expectation. Imagine torchlight dancing across stone walls, banners swaying in the drafty halls, and the quiet murmur of courtiers waiting on every royal word. To walk through these palaces was to step into a world of power and fear, of whispers and shadows, where a single decision from a king could change countless lives. It looks like legend, but the truth was far more terrible. Life near the crown was harsh. Nobles schemed in silence, armies marched without mercy, and the church watched over all with both blessing and threat. Some kings turned cruel, ruling with iron fist and bloodshed. Others slipped into madness, their minds unraveling under the crushing weight of rule. Here's the reality check. You probably wouldn't last a week. Between betrayal, paranoia, famine, and sudden violence, survival around a medieval king was as fragile as a candle flame in the wind. So, before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you truly enjoy these sleepy journeys into history. And if you'd like to make me smile, drop your location and local time in the comments. I love picturing this map of listeners spread across the world. Now, let's drift together into the age of terrible kings, glittering, dangerous, unforgettable. Paris, in the late 14th century, was alive with the hum of merchants, the clatter of hooves on cobblestones, and the toll of church bells drifting through the mist above the Seine. In the year 1380, a boy of only 11 years old was lifted unto the throne of France. His name was Charles, son of Charles V, and in those first tender years, his people called him, with affection, Charles the Beloved. At first, there was reason for hope. France had been battered by the 100 Years' War, weary from plague and taxation, but the sight of this youthful monarch brought renewed optimism. He was described as handsome, spirited, and generous of heart. Courtiers admired his chivalry. Chroniclers noted his fondness for tournaments and festivities. In candlelit halls, music echoed, banners fluttered, and the court celebrated its boy king as if the kingdom itself had been reborn. For a moment, the future of France seemed brighter than it had in decades. Charles's guardians, his uncles and close advisors, guided the realm. While he came of age, they eased some taxes, restored certain privileges, and allowed the young king to grow into his role under favorable light. To the common people, Charles appeared as a new dawn. His coronation was splendid, with processions through the streets, the perfume of incense curling around gilded altars, and the promise of stability after long hardship in these early years. His reign seemed destined for greatness, but history often hides its sharpest thorns within roses. For Charles, the turning point arrived not on a battlefield, but at a masquerade ball, an evening that began in laughter and ended in horror. It was January of 1393 when the French court gathered for the celebration of a noble wedding. The festivities included a pageant known as the Bal de Ardentes, the Ball of the Burning Men. Charles and 5 companions decided to dress as wild men, wearing costumes of linen, soaked in pitch, and covered with flax, giving them a shaggy, savage appearance. Their plan was to leap and dance to delight the crowd with their strange antics. The music swelled, the courtiers laughed, and the masqueraders pranced like spirits of the forest. But the costumes were dangerously flammable. When Charles's brother, Louis, Duke of Orleans, entered carrying a torch, disaster struck. In an instant, the flame caught. The flax and pitch erupted, turning the revel into an inferno. The dancers screamed as fire engulfed them. Guests panicked. The music faltered, and smoke filled the hall. In a moment of quick thinking, the Duchess of Berry rushed forward and threw her heavy gown over Charles himself, smothering the flames that threatened his life. 4 of his companions were not so fortunate. Their cries echoed through the palace as they burned, lingering for days in agony before death finally silenced them. Charles survived without physical scars, but something inside him broke that night. The horror of the ball, the sight of his companions aflame, and the guilt of survival began to gnaw at his mind. The event haunted him, becoming the first dark shadow in what would be a long descent into madness. In the months that followed, courtiers began to notice strange changes. Charles would sometimes wander the palace corridors without recognizing his own servants. On other days, he would lapse into silence, staring at nothing, or lash out with sudden fits of anger. At one point, he became convinced that he was made of glass and might shatter with the slightest touch, a delusion so strong that he wrapped himself in reinforced clothing and begged others not to come near. The court tried to mask these episodes. Physicians were summoned, prayers were offered, but the truth became harder to hide. France was ruled by a king whose mind was no longer whole, and in the void left by his instability, others rushed to claim power. Nobles and relatives of the king schemed for influence. Factions formed alliances, shifted, and the kingdom fractured. The Duke of Burgundy and the Duke of Orleans each vied for control, their rivalry spilling into the streets and sowing seeds of civil war. While England pressed its advantage from across the Channel, France sank deeper into disarray. For the people, the sight of their once beloved monarch stumbling through episodes of madness was both tragic and terrifying. This was not the strong protector they had hoped for, but a ruler whose illness left the nation vulnerable. Chroniclers of the time describe the grief of a people watching their sovereign unravel. Some whispered that it was divine punishment. Others feared it was sorcery. Whatever the cause, the impact was undeniable. Charles, once hailed as the beloved, was now called the mad. His reign, which had begun with such promise, became a long, sorrowful chapter of instability. Yet even in his darkest hours, Charles remained a figure of pity more than hatred. He was not cruel by design, but broken by fate. And in that brokenness, France itself fractured, dragged into a spiral of turmoil that would last for generations. As we continue with his story, we'll see how his madness reshaped not only his court, but the destiny of a kingdom already weighed down by war. Paris, in the year 1380, shimmered with both grandeur and unease. The 100 Years' War had left scars across the land, and plague still haunted memory. Yet the streets bustled with merchants, pilgrims, and nobles. On the throne sat a boy of only 11 years old. He was crowned in the Cathedral of Reims, carried through the streets with incense rising and banners unfurled. To his people, he was not just their sovereign, but a symbol of hope after long years of strife. They called him Charles the Beloved. At first, he seemed to deserve the name. Charles was handsome and bright, eager for the tournaments and pageantry that lit the medieval imagination. He loved music hunting and the grand festivities of court. Chroniclers described him as charming, with a natural warmth that drew people close. For a brief time, France seemed to heal. Taxes were eased. Justice felt less harsh, and the air of possibility returned to a kingdom exhausted by war. The boy king grew into a young monarch full of promise, and his people believed the future was safe in his hands. But history often sets its cruelest traps beneath moments of joy. In January 1393, the royal court gathered for a wedding celebration. The night was filled with laughter, wine, and anticipation for the evening's masquerade. Charles and a group of nobles dressed themselves as wild men. Their costumes of linen, soaked in pitch, covered with flax, to mimic the appearance of shaggy forest dwellers. Their plan was to leap and dance a spectacle meant to delight. The music swelled. Torches cast flickering light across the hall as the wild men pranced. Then, in a fatal moment, Charles's brother Louis entered, carrying a torch too close to the dancers. In an instant, flame leapt onto the flax and pitch. The hall erupted in screams. The costumes blazed like dry kindling, and nobles ran frantically to smother the fire. The Duchess of Berry, acting swiftly, flung her heavy robe over Charles himself, smothering the flames that threatened him. But 4 of his companions burned terribly, their cries echoing in the corridors for days until death released them. Charles survived physically unharmed, yet within him something had shifted. The ball became known as the Bal des Ardents, the Ball O. In the months that followed, Charles' behavior began to change. At first, courtiers noticed odd lapses, sudden fits of silence, bursts of anger over nothing strange, wandering through the palace at night. Then came the delusions. On one occasion, he failed to recognize his own servants. At another, he claimed he was made of glass, terrified that a touch would shatter him into pieces. He wrapped himself in reinforced clothing and begged people not to approach. The court tried to conceal these episodes, but whispers spread. Physicians were summoned, charms and prayers invoked. Yet the king's mind slipped further. France was left with a sovereign who could no longer rule with reason, and in the vacuum of his madness, rival factions rose to seize power. The Dukes of Orleans and Burgundy maneuvered at court, each claiming authority in the king's name. Their rivalry grew bitter, erupting into violence that spilled beyond the palace into the very streets of Paris. Alliances shifted, plots thickened, and France was pulled toward civil war. Meanwhile, England, ever watchful, pressed its advantage, deepening the kingdom's troubles. For the people of France, the transformation of their beloved king was heartbreaking. The boy who had embodied hope now wandered, lost within his own mind. Some saw his condition as divine punishment, others as the work of sorcery, but all felt the weight of his decline. What had begun as a reign of promise dissolved into decades of instability. Charles remained on the throne until his death, but he was king in name only. His illness rendered him incapable of steady rule, and his realm fractured under the ambitions of those around him. The Armagnac-Burgundian Civil War, fueled by his incapacity, dragged France into deeper suffering. It was not until the rise of Joan of Arc long after his worst years, that the kingdom found new hope. And so Charles VI of France is remembered with two names, the beloved and the mad. The first belonged to the boy who inspired dreams of renewal. The second clung to the man undone by tragedy, whose fragile mind mirrored the fragility of the realm itself. He was not cruel by design, but broken by fate. And in that brokenness, France itself shattered. From the halls of Paris, we now journey across the Channel to the troubled court of England, where another gentle soul bore the crown. Henry, like Charles, was a man unsuited for the ruthless demands of kingship, his reign defined by piety, fragility, and a kingdom spiraling into chaos. As Charles' mind slipped further away, the kingdom bore the cost. Periods of lucidity would come and go, but his illness always returned. In one moment, he might preside over court with dignity, and in the next he would erupt into violence, convinced that assassins lurked in the shadows. On several occasions, he failed to recognize his own queen, Isabeau of Bavaria, and accused her of being an impostor. At other times, he fled through the corridors of the palace, wild-eyed, terrified of imagined threats. The burden of ruling fell to others, but instead of unity, their rivalry tore France apart. The Duke of Orleans, Louis, pressed his claim as the king's brother. The Duke of Burgundy, from one of the most powerful families in Europe, maneuvered for equal influence. Each used the king's incapacity as justification to act in his name, and each gathered followers, advisors, and soldiers, loyal only to their cause. The court became a battlefield without swords. Daggers were hidden behind smiles, and every council meeting carried the tension of barely concealed hatred. This struggle spilled beyond the palace walls. The factions became known as the Armagnacs, who supported the Orleans line, and the Burgundians, loyal to Burgundy's claim. Their rivalry hardened into civil war. Paris, the heart of the kingdom, saw riots and massacres as mobs loyal to one faction turned upon the other. Blood stained the cobblestones where once the bells of Notre Dame had tolled in celebration of the beloved child king. Meanwhile, England looked across the Channel with keen eyes. The English crown had long pressed its claim to France, and Charles's illness offered opportunity. With France divided, campaigns resumed. The conflict would grow into some of the darkest chapters of the 100 Years' War, with French unity shattered just when it was needed most. For ordinary people, life under Charles V became a time of uncertainty. Taxes rose again to fund endless wars. Armies marched across farmlands, leaving destruction in their wake. Famine followed, harvest failures, and disease returned with grim regularity. Amid this misery, the figure of the king, once so full of promise, stood as a tragic reminder of hopes dashed. He was not remembered for cruelty like other monarchs, but for absence, for a reign where the throne stood empty even as he lived. Isabeau of Bavaria, Charles's queen, became a central figure during his breakdowns. She acted as regent when the king was incapacitated, but her presence was not enough to hold the realm together. Accusations swirled around her of corruption and infidelity. Whether fair or not, such rumors reflected the desperation of a kingdom searching for stability where none could be found. Chroniclers describe her as both strong and reviled, a woman caught in the crossfire of ambition and fear. Charles's delusions grew darker with time. On occasion, he believed he was not the king at all, but another man entirely. At others, he raged that enemies had poisoned him, and he demanded purges of those who served him most loyally. Advisors and servants alike lived in constant uncertainty, never knowing when the monarch they served would suddenly denounce them. By the 1410s, the Armagnac-Burgundian feud had become full-scale civil war. In 1415, the English won their shocking victory at Agincourt, made possible in part by the divisions within France. The humiliation cut deep. A generation earlier, France had imagined greatness under its young king. Now, it staggered under the combined weight of madness and defeat. Charles lingered for decades in this state, neither fully present nor entirely absent. His reign became one of the longest in French history, 42 years, but much of that time was marked by the absence of his leadership. Chroniclers who had once praised him with warmth now wrote of pity, even sorrow, at the sight of a monarch who seemed to have lost himself. At last, in October of 1422, Charles died in Paris. He was 53 years old. His death marked the end of an era that had begun in hope and ended in despair. France lay divided, much of its territory under English control, its crown contested. The beloved boy king had become the mad king, whose broken mind had mirrored the broken state of his kingdom. Yet history remembers him not with hatred, but with melancholy. He was not a tyrant who sought cruelty, nor a schemer who betrayed his people. He was instead a man undone by forces beyond his control, carried down into illness that stripped him of reason. The tragedy of Charles VI lies not in deliberate wickedness, but in helplessness, an image of how fragile even the mightiest crown can be when the mind beneath it falters. As we close his chapter, we drift across the channel to another monarch whose gentle nature and fragile spirit placed him at odds with the brutal demands of kingship. Like Charles, he was a man born to rule, yet unsuited to the storms of power. His reign would be marked by kindness, devotion, and collapse into ruin. This is the story of Henry VI of England, a king too good-hearted for the ruthless age into which he was born. England in the year 1422 was a kingdom still glowing with the victories of its warrior king Henry V. Only months earlier, Henry had secured triumph at Agincourt, a battle so legendary that its echoes carried across Europe. Yet fate is often cruel. Henry V died young, leaving the throne to his infant son. That child was Henry VI, a boy destined to wear a crown before he could even walk. At first, England rejoiced at the hope of continuity. The boy king was delicate, yet gentle in demeanor. As he grew, his nature revealed itself, soft-spoken, pious, and disinclined toward violence. He loved prayer more than pageantry books, more than battles. When he reached manhood, contemporaries described him as handsome and serene, a figure who seemed to embody Christian virtue. Unlike so many monarchs of his age, Henry disliked bloodshed, preferring instead the quiet pursuits of faith and learning. Yet to be king in the 15th century was to preside over a realm teeming with restless nobles, foreign wars, and constant threats to authority. For such a world, Henry's gentle soul was ill-matched. He sought peace, where others sought advantage. He preferred compromise, while factions demanded strength. And though his intentions were good, they left him vulnerable to manipulation by ambitious lords, eager to guide or seize the helm of state. Among Henry's most enduring legacies was his devotion to education. He founded two of England's most prestigious schools, Eton College and King's College, Cambridge. To him, the nurturing of faith and learning was as noble a cause as conquest. Cloisters and classrooms mattered more in his eyes than castles or campaigns. For scholars and priests, Henry seemed a blessing, but for soldiers and nobles, he appeared weak. In a time when kings were expected to ride into battle and enforce their will with steel, Henry's reluctance to fight seemed almost unthinkable. The defining shadow of his reign emerged in 1453. That year, after years of strain from war with France and turmoil at home, Henry collapsed into a state of near catatonia. He could not speak, could not move with purpose, could not even recognize his own wife, Queen Margaret of Anjou, or their newborn son. For more than a year, England effectively had no king. Power shifted to regents and protectors, and rivalries sharpened. When Henry recovered, his weakness was plain to all. His gentle manner inspired pity, but not obedience. Nobles, such as Richard, Duke of York, and the great houses of Lancaster and York, maneuvered with increasing boldness. Their disputes hardened into open conflict, and soon England was plunged into the Wars of the Roses. Henry, unwilling or unable to master his fractious lords, became a pawn in their struggles. Margaret of Anjou, his queen, took a fiercer role. Strong-willed and ambitious, she fought tirelessly to preserve the Lancastrian claim for her son. Where Henry was meek, Margaret was fierce. Where he sought prayer, she gathered armies. Chroniclers portray her as both formidable and controversial, a woman ruling in her husband's stead, often despised for her foreign birth, yet indispensable to the survival of her line. Henry himself drifted between lucidity and collapse. At times, he could pray with clarity, speaking words of devotion that inspired those around him. At others, he lapsed into vacant silence, lost to the world. His reign became a pattern of absence, a king physically present but politically powerless. In the ruthless politics of the 15th century, such frailty was unforgivable. The Wars of the Roses raged on, and Henry's fortunes rose and fell with them. Captured, restored, imprisoned again, he seemed like a ghost drifting through his own reign. The crown slipped from his control as rival claimants fought bloody battles across the countryside. Castles changed hands, families were destroyed, and England bled. In 1471, after years of shifting fortunes, Henry VI met his end. Captured once more and confined to the Tower of London, he died under mysterious circumstances. Officially, he passed away of melancholy. Many believed, however, that he was quietly murdered on the orders of Edward IV, the victorious Yorkist king. His death closed a chapter of sorrow for the Lancastrians, but it opened a legend. Henry the saintly king, the gentle soul, the ruler who had been too kind for his brutal age. In later years, Henry was remembered not as a tyrant, but almost as a martyr. Pilgrims came to pray at his tomb, believing miracles could be wrought through his intercession. He was not revered for his governance. Indeed, his reign had been one of chaos and civil war, but for his innocence, his purity, and his strange holiness amid disaster, Henry stands in history as a mirror to Charles V of France. Both were monarchs undone by mental fragility. Both left their kingdoms fractured, and both became symbols of how the mind of a king could shape the fate of nations. Where Charles fell into madness, marked by delusion and terror, Henry slipped into stillness, a quiet collapse of will. Each in his way revealed the vulnerability hidden beneath the crown's glittering weight. And so, as we drift from the troubled soul of Henry VIII, we turn our gaze northward to Scandinavia. There, a Renaissance prince named Eric the V of Sweden would dazzle his court with brilliance and refinement, only to see his reign unravel in paranoia, delusion, and betrayal. His story, like those before him, shows how fragile the mind of a king could be, and how costly its collapse was to the realm he ruled. Henry VI's story begins in tragedy before he could even know his own name. His father, Henry V, was the warrior king whose triumph at Agincourt in 1415 became legend. Songs and chronicles told of the English arrows darkening the sky of French knights, trampled in the mud of a king who embodied strength and glory. Yet in 1415, this hero died suddenly at the age of 35, leaving behind an infant son, only 9 months old. That baby, Henry inherited not only the crown of England, but also a claim to the throne of France. Never before had a child borne such a heavy burden. The infant was proclaimed king in Westminster Abbey while still in swaddling clothes. Courtiers bowed before a child who could not speak, could not stand, could not even understand the meaning of the crown placed above him. Regents and uncles governed in his name, but the image of a tiny boy as sovereign created both awe and unease. England had long been a realm where strength was survival, and here was a king who embodied innocence itself. As Henry grew, he revealed a nature utterly unlike his father's. Where Henry V had been bold, commanding, and fierce in battle, Henry VI was quiet, timid, and deeply pious. He found solace in chapels and scriptures, often preferring to spend long hours in prayer rather than in council chambers. He showed kindness to those around him, forgiving slights that others would have punished, and treating servants with gentleness, rare in royal households. But in a century defined by ambition, war, and suspicion, these very virtues became his greatest weakness. England's nobles quickly recognized that Henry could be guided or manipulated. Decisions were often made for him rather echo than by him. Advisors, protectors, and ambitious lords stepped into the vacuum, each pressing their own interests. The court became a stage of endless rivalry with the young king as a figurehead at its center. His reluctance to quarrel only deepened the problem, for while he hesitated, others acted. Henry's gentleness, however, also left behind enduring contributions. He valued learning with a devotion uncommon among kings of the age, inspired by his vision of a kingdom anchored in faith and knowledge. He founded Eton College in 40 and King's College, Cambridge, in 14. These institutions, built of stone and spirit, remain among England's most prestigious centers of education. Their chapels still echo with hymns that reflect Henry's devotion. In this, he left a legacy that outlived the wars and chaos of his reign. But while schools rose in glory, Henry's political world crumbled. England's hold over France, so proudly secured by his father, began to collapse. The Treaty of Troyes, which had recognized Henry V as heir to the French crown, unraveled in the face of French resistance and the growing strength of Charles VII. By 1453, the same year of Henry's great breakdown, England lost Bordeaux, the last jewel of its French possessions apart from Calais. Centuries of conquest dissolved in defeat, and the dream of an English France died. It was this year that Henry's mind seemed to give way, overwhelmed by the loss, exhausted by factional struggles at home, and perhaps burdened by hereditary fragility. He fell into catatonic stupor. For more than a year, he spoke no word, recognized no faith, and gave no sign of ruling presence. His Queen Margaret of Anjou gave birth to their son Edward during this time, but Henry did not acknowledge the child. For England, it was as though the crown itself had vanished into silence. Margaret of Anjou stepped forward with determination. Born of a powerful French family, she was intelligent, strong-willed, and unwilling to surrender her husband's crown or her son's inheritance. Many contemporaries called her the manliest of women, for she wielded authority with a boldness few expected of a queen. Yet her foreign birth and assertive manner made her unpopular among many nobles. Whispers accused her of ruling in her own right, of manipulating the king, even of adultery. Whether true or not, these accusations reflected a kingdom in turmoil, desperate for someone to blame. The rivalries at court sharpened into open hostility. Richard, Duke of York, a descendant of Edward III, pressed his own claim to the throne. The great houses of Lancaster and York, once united under one crown, split into bitter enemies. In 1455, at the First Battle of St. Albans, blood was spilled in what would become known as the Wars of the Roses. Henry himself, present at the battle, was wounded, a pitiful figure caught between forces he could not control. For the next 2 decades, Henry's reign was less a rule than a pendulum. At times, the Lancastrians, led fiercely by Margaret, held the advantage. At others, the Yorkists surged forward. Henry himself was captured, restored, and captured again. Chroniclers speak of him wandering aimlessly, muttering prayers as battles raged around him. To many, he seemed like a ghost, haunting his own kingdom, powerless amid the storm. The great turning point came at the Battle of Towton in 1460, one of the bloodiest ever fought on English soil. Snow fell as thousands clashed and rivers ran red with blood. The Yorkist, Edward IV, emerged victorious, and Henry fled with Margaret and their son into exile. For years, he drifted between captivity and escape, a king in name only. Yet despite the chaos, Henry's personal piety never wavered. Even his enemies admitted that he seemed saintly in character. He preferred forgiveness to vengeance, prayer to judgment, gentleness to wrath. In another world, he might have been a beloved monk or scholar, but fate had placed a crown upon his head, and the weight of kingship crushed him. In 1470, through a strange twist of alliances, Henry was briefly restored to the throne. For a short time, he sat once more in Westminster, but he was a shadow of a king, frail and passive, while Margaret and her allies tried to hold power in his name. Their efforts failed swiftly. In 1471, the Yorkists triumphed again at the Battle of Tewkesbury. Margaret was captured, her son killed, and Henry returned to the Tower of London. It was there on the night of May 21st, 1471, that Henry VI met his end. Official records claimed he died of melancholy, but many believed he was murdered on the orders of Edward IV. Chroniclers tell of him found lifeless in his cell, his hands folded as though in prayer. The tower, with its cold stones and silent corridors, had swallowed yet another king. In the years that followed, Henry's reputation transformed. To some, he was remembered as a failed monarch whose weakness plunged England into civil war. But to others, he became a figure of sanctity, a gentle soul martyred by the brutality of his age. Pilgrims visited his tomb at Windsor, reporting miracles and healings at his shrine. In their eyes, Henry VI was less a king than a saint. too pure for the world into which he had been born. His reign left England torn, his dynasty broken, and his crown lost. Yet his memory endured in a paradox, the king who could not rule, but who inspired devotion, the monarch whose gentleness was his ruin, but also his grace. He stands alongside Charles of France as a symbol of how fragile the human mind can be beneath the crushing demands of power. From the stillness of Henry's story, we turn northward to Scandinavia, where a Renaissance prince rose with brilliance, only to see his reign dissolve into paranoia and madness. Eric of Sweden would dazzle his court with promise, then sink into delusion and tragedy. His tale continues our journey into the darkest chamber of the medieval crown. The summer sun lingered long over Stockholm in the year 1560. It was June, and the city bustled with excitement as banners rippled in the clear northern air. Along the cobbled streets, citizens craned their necks to catch sight of their young monarch, a man who seemed the very image of promise. His name was Eric, son of Gustav Vasa, and at 27 years old, he inherited a kingdom eager for strength, culture, and stability. From the beginning, Eric Gui shone like a Renaissance prince. He had received a refined education, learning not only theology and politics, but also several languages. Courtiers praised his intelligence, his handsome figure, and his charisma. He adored poetry, music, and painting. He surrounded himself with artists, astronomers, and scholars, cultivating a court that glimmered with refinement. To many he appeared the embodiment of a new golden age, for Sweden, cultured, brilliant, and ambitious. But brilliance can hide fragility, and beneath Eric's glittering surface lay a mind shadowed by anxiety and suspicion. His reign began with bold steps. He strengthened Sweden's defenses, encouraged trade, and sought to expand influence in the Baltic. Yet his ambitions bred enemies both abroad and at home. Denmark watched uneasily. Powerful noble families grumbled at his reforms. Even within his own bloodline, his half-brothers eyed him with envy. At first, Eric carried himself with confidence. He dazzled in tournaments, commissioned fine works, and sought to align Sweden with the Renaissance flowering across Europe. But soon, darker signs appeared. Eric's temper grew unpredictable. Where once he charmed courtiers with wit, he began to erupt in sudden fury. At other times, he withdrew into silence, brooding over imagined conspiracies. The pressure of kingship weighed heavily. He feared assassination, betrayal plots, whispered in corners. His paranoia grew until even loyal servants fell under suspicion. Advisors warned him gently, but Eric would not listen. He convinced himself that treachery surrounded him, and he determined to root it out. The most infamous moment of his descent came in 1567 in what is remembered as the Stour murders. Convinced that the noble Stour family plotted against him, Eric had several of them arrested. In a fit of rage, he personally killed Niels Stour, striking him down with his own hands. Others followed, cut down in cold chambers where once royal banquets had been held. The court recoiled in horror. Here was not the cultivated Renaissance prince they had adored, but a monarch spiraling into blood and madness. After these murders, Eric's mind seemed to fracture further. He wandered the corridors of his palace, muttering to himself, eyes wide with suspicion. He claimed at times that he was not Eric at all, but another man entirely. Sleep eluded him, and meals went untouched as he raved about conspiracies only he could see. His half-brothers particularly, John, later John III, sensed their moment had come. Eric's marriage to Karin, Mon's daughter, a commoner, further weakened his position among nobles. Though Karin was devoted and gentle-loved even by those who despised the king, the marriage raged the aristocracy. They saw it as an insult, a sign that Eric had abandoned royal dignity. In truth, Karin remained his anchor, the only person who could soothe him in moments of agitation. She sat with him through long nights, calming his terrors, holding his hand when suspicion threatened to consume him. By 1568, the nobles had had enough. John, with their support, rebelled. Eric was deposed and imprisoned. From king, he became captive. His crown stripped, his once glittering court dissolved. For nearly a decade, he lingered in confinement, his health failing his mind, unraveling further. He scribbled letters filled with frantic pleas and delusions alternating between paranoia and tenderness. Karin remained by his side, a rare light in his darkening world. She tended to him, soothed his fears, and remained loyal even as his dignity faded. Chroniclers tell us she was often the only one able to quiet his restless pacing or calm his sudden outbursts. But not even her devotion could halt the slow decline. In 1577, Eric Obodekin died at the age of 43. Many believed he was poisoned on the orders of his brother John, who now sat upon the throne. His burial was hurried without the grandeur once promised to him. The brilliant Renaissance prince, who had dreamed of glory and refinement, ended his life broken, forgotten, and betrayed. Yet his memory lingers with a peculiar sadness. Eric was not a tyrant by design, but a man undone by the fragility of his mind. He had everything: intelligence, charm, ambition, and yet, in the end, he held nothing. His reign became a warning that brilliance without stability can collapse into tragedy. For Sweden, Erik XIV remains a figure of paradox, both cultured and cruel, visionary and delusional, a king of immense promise who squandered it all in suspicion. In his story, we hear the same as Charles VI of France and Henry VI of England, the lesson that a monarch's mind could shape and even shatter the destiny of a nation. And so, as we leave the cold halls of Stockholm, we turn eastward across forests and rivers to the vast reaches of Russia. There waits a ruler whose name is spoken with both awe and dread. Ivan IV, known as Ivan the Terrible, began as a hero and ended as a tyrant, his paranoia carving a path of terror across his realm. His tale, more violent and more infamous, still awaits us in the next chapter. Erik XIV's beginnings were wrapped in both promise and burden. Born in 1533, he was the son of Gustav Vasa, the great king who had wrestled Sweden's independence from Denmark and laid the foundations of a strong monarchy. Gustav was shrewd, pragmatic, and determined, and he raised his sons in a world where loyalty and survival were never guaranteed. Erik the eldest received an education more refined than most princes of the north. Tutors instructed him in theology, history, mathematics, and the new discoveries of the Renaissance. He read Latin and German, dabbled in Italian poetry, and absorbed the culture of courts far beyond Sweden's frozen lakes and forests. This education set him apart. When visitors from abroad came to Stockholm, they found in Erik not a rough northern warrior, but a cultivated prince. He spoke with fluency, asked questions about astronomy and medicine, and seemed eager to place Sweden among the enlightened kingdoms of Europe. His tall frame and fine features made him a striking figure, and in his youth, courtiers whispered that perhaps he might bring Sweden to heights never seen before. When his father died in 1560, Erik ascended the throne with confidence. The coronation was splendid, filled with days of feasting, jousts, and pageantry. Nobles watched with mixed feelings, some inspired by his brilliance, others wary of his restless ambition. For Erik dreamed not only of ruling Sweden, but of asserting dominance over the Baltic, of securing alliances across Europe, and of reshaping his kingdom into a Renaissance power. He surrounded himself with scholars, musicians, and artists. His court glittered with conversation about the stars, about the latest works of cartography, about medical experiments and new ideas stirring in distant Italy. Painters depicted his likeness with regal dignity, while musicians filled the halls with polyphonic hymns. Delighted in such refinements, unlike many of his forebears, he saw kingship as not only a matter of battlefields and taxes, but of culture and intellect. Yet ambition comes at a cost. Eric sought to marry into great houses abroad to secure alliances, but his negotiations faltered. Denmark, Poland, and England all hesitated, finding him brilliant but unstable. His half-brothers, John and Charles, grew resentful of his dominance and cultivated their own circles of power. At the same time, Sweden's nobles grew suspicious. Eric distrusted them, preferring to elevate new men of lower birth into positions of influence, which only deepened noble hostility. Beyond his court, war loomed. The Northern 7 Years' War erupted in 1560, pitting Sweden against Denmark, Lubeck, and Poland. Eric's reign became entangled in the conflict. At first, he tried to present himself as a commander in the mold of his father, but his suspicious mind interfered with strategy. He quarreled with his generals, suspected betrayal in every setback, and lashed out at imagined traitors. Victories were few, defeats frequent, and the war drained the treasury. It was during these years that Eric's mental instability began to surface more openly. He suffered sudden fits of rage. Courtiers described him pacing for hours, muttering to himself, bursting without cause. He accused loyal servants of plotting against him, dismissed counselors in waves, and filled their places with men who fed his fears rather than calmed them. The atmosphere of court grew tense, as if every banquet might dissolve into accusation, and every council meeting into an eruption. The breaking point came with the Sture murders of 1567. The Sture family, long influential in Sweden, were suspected by Eric of treason. Paranoia consumed him until he convinced himself that they plotted his death. In a sudden frenzy, Eric personally killed Niels Sture, stabbing him with his own hands. Other members of the family were executed soon after their deaths, staining the royal chambers with dread. The court was horrified. The nobles trembled, realizing that no lineage, however ancient, could protect them from a king unmoored from reason. After these murders, Eric's paranoia deepened into delusion. At times, he declared he was no longer the king, but another man entirely. At others, He believed invisible enemies moved through the palace walls. Food was brought with care, for he feared poison in every dish. He alternated between violent outbursts and hollow silence, his eyes darting with suspicion. Amid this unraveling, one figure remained constant: Karin Monsdotter. Unlike the high-born ladies whom Eric had once courted for alliances, Karin was of common birth, a servant who captured his heart with quiet devotion. Their marriage scandalized the nobles, but Eric clung to her with desperate need. She alone could soothe him during his worst episodes, holding his hand, singing softly, easing the storms of his mind. Chroniclers note that in her presence the, the king found fleeting peace, as if her gentleness could still the tempests no counselor could quell. Yet love could not protect him from politics. In VIII, his half-brother John, supported by disaffected nobles, rose in rebellion. The kingdom could no longer bear a monarch so consumed by suspicion and violence. Eric was captured and forced to abdicate. Stripped of crown and title, he was led into captivity, a king reduced to a prisoner. His years in confinement were long and bleak. Letters from this time reveal a man swinging between lucidity and delusion. Some days he wrote with clarity, pleading for mercy, reflecting on faith. On others, he raved in frantic scrawls, convinced that dark conspiracies closed in around him. Karin remained loyal, visiting him, soothing his broken mind, and refusing to abandon him. For her devotion, she is remembered with sympathy, even by those who despised Eric. But time offered no reprieve. In 1577, at the age of 43, Eric the 14th died in captivity. Many believed he was poisoned on the orders of John, the brother who had taken his throne. His burial was hurried and without honor. Once hailed as the brilliant prince who would bring Sweden glory, he was laid in the earth as a broken man, stripped of dignity, remembered more for madness than for majesty. Yet history's judgment has not been simple. Some see in Eric a tyrant stained by the blood of nobles and undone by paranoia. Others see a tragic figure, a man of immense potential, who fell victim to an illness beyond his control. He was capable of brilliance, yet haunted by shadows that warped his reign. He dreamed of making Sweden a beacon of Renaissance power, but instead left it shaken by war and distrust. The memory of Eric the 14th lingers with melancholy. His reign serves as a reminder that intelligence and refinement are no guarantee against fragility. A king may read the stars, commission music, and inspire awe, but if the mind falters, the kingdom falters with it. Like Charles VI of France and Henry VI of England, Eric stands as a testament to the peril of fragile kingship, how one man's inner demons can spill outward and fracture a realm. And so as our thoughts drift away from the northern courts of Stockholm, we turn eastward across the forests and rivers into the vast expanse of Russia. There another monarch waits, one far more violent, remembered not for fragility, but for ferocity. Ivan IV, known to history as Ivan the Terrible, began his reign with triumphs and reforms, but descended into a reign of terror unlike any other. His story, darker still, lies ahead. In the years after Eric's death, Sweden struggled to reconcile his memory. To some, he was nothing more than a tyrant, remembered for the blood of the Sture family and the chaos of his paranoia. To others, he seemed almost pitiable, a brilliant mind undone by illness, a man who might have been great had fate been kinder. The nobles who had feared him spoke in hushed tones of his instability, while common people who had seen little of his courtly brilliance, but heard much of his downfall, passed along stories colored by sorrow and unease. Legends grew in the countryside, whispers that Eric still wandered the forests at night, his restless spirit unable to find peace. Some said his soul lingered near the castles where he had raged. Others, that Karin's devotion had granted him a measure of gentleness in the afterlife. For historians, he became a puzzle, both a Renaissance ruler who dreamed of refinement and a tragic figure undone by madness. His reign left scars but also questions. What might Sweden have become if Eric's mind had remained whole? His brother John attempted to restore order, but Eric's shadow lingered over the throne. The court carried on with its ceremonies, yet a note of caution ran through every pageant. Nobles remembered too well how quickly brilliance could turn to terror, how fragile the glitter of a crown truly was. In this way, Eric's downfall taught a lesson as stark as any battle that unchecked power, when joined to a broken mind, could devastate a kingdom more thoroughly than foreign armies. And so Eric Polkind stands among history's tragic kings, his life a cautionary tale told in a lull of sadness rather than rage. He was not the monster that fear painted him to be, nor the saint that love tried to remember, but a man caught between brilliance and fragility. His story flows into a greater pattern, joining the sorrowful tales of Charles VI of France and Henry VI of England. All were rulers who began with promise and ended in ruin, undone not by the sword, but by the storms of the mind. From the quiet waters of Sweden, our journey now drifts eastward into the boundless expanse of Russia. There, we find a ruler remembered not for fragility, but for ferocity. Ivan IV, called Ivan the Terrible. His reign began in triumph with victories and reforms, but ended in terror, his paranoia shaping a realm of blood and fear. His tale, darker, still waits ahead. The land of Russia in the 16th century was vast, stretching from the forests of Muscovy to the endless steppes. It was a land of wooden churches, with onion domes gleaming in the sun, of peasants toiling in fields, of boyars, the noble families brooding in their fortified houses, and at the center of this sprawling realm stood a child who would grow into one of the most infamous rulers of history, Ivan Vasilievich, later called Ivan the Terrible. He was born in 830 within the Kremlin walls, the son of Grand Prince Vasily III. But Ivan's childhood was scarred by loss and cruelty. His father died when Ivan was only 3, leaving the throne to a toddler. His mother, Elena Glinskaya, acted as regent, but she too died mysteriously when Ivan was just 8 years old. Many whispered of poison. The boy, suddenly orphaned, was left in the care of feuding boyar families who neglected him, mocked him, and even abused him. These early wounds sank deep. Ivan grew up in an atmosphere of suspicion and fear. He wandered the halls of the Kremlin, hungry and neglected, watching noble families seize power for themselves while ignoring the child they were supposed to serve. Sometimes he was given no food, no comfort, only the sight of cruelty inflicted on others. In later years, Ivan would recall these slights with bitterness. The boy humiliated by nobles' woot. When Ivan was 16, he shocked the court by doing something no ruler of Muscovy had done before he crowned himself Tsar. The title, derived from Caesar, signaled his ambition to be more than just a prince. He saw himself as a ruler with absolute authority, a figure chosen by God to command Russia as no man had before. The coronation in 1547 was splendid, filled with processions, hymns, and symbols of both Russian tradition and Byzantine grandeur. A new era at first. Ivan's reign appeared promising. He embarked on reforms to strengthen the state. He created a council of advisors known as the Chosen Wada, improved the legal code, and reorganized the military. He promoted men based on merit rather than noble birth, undermining the boyars who had tormented his youth. He even established the, the first printing press in Russia, spreading religious texts and learning. For a moment, it seemed Ivan might become a wise and visionary ruler. On the battlefield, he proved formidable. Ivan launched campaigns against the Khanates of Kazan and Astrakhan successor states of the Mongol Golden Horde. His armies triumphed, annexing vast territories along the Volga River and extending Russia's borders to the Caspian Sea. In Moscow, bells rang, and people rejoiced, hailing their Tsar as a conquering hero who had brought glory to the realm. The conquest of Kazan in 1552 became a legend, celebrated in songs and chronicles. Yet beneath these victories, shadows stirred. Ivan's paranoia, seeded in childhood, never left him. When his beloved first wife, Anastasia Romanovna, died in 1560, likely of illness, but perhaps of poison, Ivan's suspicion consumed him. He became convinced that the boyars had murdered her to weaken him. Grief twisted into rage, and his reign took a darker turn. He withdrew from the chosen, Rada abandoned reform, and turned against those he once trusted. In 1565, he created the Oprichnina, a separate domain under his direct control. It was enforced by the Oprichniki, his black-clad secret police, who rode dark horses through the streets with severed dogs' heads tied to their saddles, symbols of their loyalty to sniff out treason. These men were utterly ruthless, confiscating land, torturing suspects, and executing those accused of disloyalty. Towns were terrorized, noble families destroyed, and ordinary people lived in fear. Ivan himself joined in the cruelty. He ordered mass executions, reveling in displays of power. In 1570, he turned his fury on Novgorod, accusing the ancient city of plotting with enemies. The Oprichniki descended upon it in winter, dragging thousands to their deaths in the frozen Volkhov River or torturing them in the streets. The massacre scarred the land, its memory echoing for generations. Amid this reign of terror, Ivan's personal life grew more unstable. His rages became legendary. Servants and courtiers feared to speak in his presence, for a misplaced word could trigger his wrath. His paranoia deepened. Betrayal seemed to lurk in every shadow. And then, in 1581, tragedy struck within his own family. In a fit of rage during an argument, Ivan struck his eldest son and heir, also named Ivan, with his iron-tipped staff. The blow was fatal as the young Tsarevich collapsed. Blood, spilling, the Tsar's fury evaporated into horror. He wept over his dying son, crying out in despair. But it was too late. The heir he had loved and relied upon was gone, killed by his own father's hand. That moment shattered what remained of Ivan's spirit. He sank into grief, alternating between violent outbursts and desperate prayers for forgiveness. He grew ill, consumed by guilt and paranoia, yet clung to power until the end. In 1584, while playing a game of chess, Ivan collapsed and died. According to legend, his final move had placed his king piece in checkmate, as though he acknowledged the inevitability of his own defeat. Ivan's legacy is complex. To some, he was a great ruler who expanded Russia's borders and strengthened the autocracy. To others, he was a monster who drenched his land in blood and terror. In Russian folklore, he became both hero and villain, a figure of awe and dread. His reign laid the foundations for Imperial Russia, but it also left scars that would haunt the nation for centuries. And so Ivan the Terrible remains a figure of contradiction, brilliant and brutal, visionary and paranoid, a ruler whose name still evokes shivers. His story reminds us that power without restraint can curdle into tyranny, and that the demons of one man's mind can become the nightmare of an entire nation. As our thoughts drift from the snowbound rivers of Russia, we turn southward across seas and centuries to the ancient empire of Byzantium. There we will meet Justin Isas, a ruler whose mind, like Charles of France, Henry of England, and Eric of Sweden, faltered beneath the weight of the crown. His reign, too, became a cautionary tale of fragility, delusion, and the heavy cost of kingship. Ivan Vasilievich's earliest years left scars that shaped everything to come. After the death of his father and then his mother, the boy who would become Tsar found himself at the mercy of quarreling noble families. Within the Kremlin walls, he was both prince and orphan. He watched the boyars seize power, plotting and feasting, while he, their rightful sovereign, wandered neglected. Servants sometimes denied him food or clothing. Guards struck him when he displeased them. From windows he watched as dogs tore apart prisoners in the courtyard. Below, spectacles arranged by nobles to amuse themselves. These images imprinted themselves upon his mind: cruelty as entertainment, power as domination, mercy as weakness. As Ivan grew older, his brilliance became apparent. He absorbed scripture, read chronicles, and memorized long passages from saints' lives. But this learning mingled with bitterness. He would later confess that as a child, he longed for vengeance, imagining himself trampling his tormentors beneath horses' hooves. When he came of age, he carried both scripture and suspicion in his heart, a mixture that made him both devout and dangerous. His coronation at 16 marked a turning point in Russian history. By choosing the title of Tsar, a word echoing Caesar, he declared himself not merely prince among equals, but sovereign above all. It was more than ceremony. Ivan claimed sacred authority, a ruler anointed by God whose word could not be challenged. The crown placed upon his head gleamed as choirs sang, and the young Tsar promised a new era of strength. At first, hope seemed justified. Ivan worked with a circle of reformers to reshape governance. He convened the Zemsky Sobor, a kind of national assembly. He revised the legal code in the Sudebnik of 1550, clarifying justice across his land. He reorganized the military, creating units of Streltsy musketeers armed with firearms, a modern innovation for Russia. He opened new avenues of administration, reducing the unchecked power of boyars and giving more voice to lesser nobles and townsmen. His first years saw triumphs on the battlefield as well. The conquest of Kazan was not only a military victory but also a spiritual one. Chroniclers tell of Ivan, clad in armor, riding at the head of his troops while priests carried holy icons before the army. When Kazan fell, it marked the end of centuries of Tatar domination. Russia celebrated with the construction of St. Basil's Cathedral in Moscow, its colorful domes rising like a dream above Red Square. Soon after Astrakhan, too fell, and Russia gained vast stretches of territory along the Volga. These victories filled Ivan with pride and Russia with hope. Songs were sung of the Tsar as a new Constantine expanding Christendom against the infidel. Merchants looked forward to trade flowing down the Volga to the Caspian. For a moment, it seemed Ivan might rival the great monarchs of Europe, but triumph carried seeds of overreach. Ivan sought access to the Baltic Sea, determined to open Russia to European trade. In 1558, he launched the Livonian War, seeking to seize lands from the weakening Livonian order. At first, success came swiftly, but soon Sweden, Poland, Lithuania, and Denmark united against him. The war dragged on for decades, draining Russia's coffers and manpower. Cities were besieged. Peasants fled the fields and famine spread. What had begun as a dream of prosperity became a quagmire of suffering. Amid this strain, tragedy struck at home. In 1560, Ivan's beloved wife Anastasia died. He adored her deeply, seeing in her the one figure who soothed his darker moods. Her death, likely from illness, but suspected by Ivan to be poison, shattered him. Convinced the boyars had murdered her, he withdrew into grief and paranoia. He lashed out, dismissing advisers, executing servants, and retreating into suspicion. The gentle side of his nature, nurtured by Anastasia, seemed to vanish with her. It was in this darkness that the Oprichnina was born, declaring he could no longer rule alongside treacherous boyars. Ivan divided Russia into two realms, the Zemshchina, left to the nobles, and the Oprichnina, his personal domain. The Oprichniki, his dreaded enforcers, rode black horses through the land, their saddles adorned with brooms and dogs' heads, to symbolize their mission to sweep away treachery and sniff out betrayal. They dressed in black, carried out mass confiscations, and executed entire families. Villages suspected of disloyalty were burned, their inhabitants slaughtered or driven into exile. Life under the Oprichnina was one of fear. The knock at the door at midnight could mean disappearance. Property could be seized without trial. Whole towns like Novgorod were accused of treason and punished with massacre. In 1570, Ivan's fury fell upon that city. For weeks, the Oprichniki dragged its people through frozen streets, drowning them in icy rivers, burning them in their homes. Thousands perished. Chroniclers wrote of smoke rising like a black shroud over Novgorod, the cries of the dying mingling with the howling winter wind. Yet Ivan himself was not without moments of remorse. He alternated between terror and penitence. After commanding executions, he would spend hours in prayer weeping before icons begging for forgiveness. He ordered new monasteries built endowed churches and sought absolution from priests. His nogar was a constant contradiction, the pious ruler who prostrated himself before God, and the tyrant who unleashed cruelty upon his subjects. The most haunting tragedy came within his own family. In 1518, during a quarrel with his eldest son and heir, also named Ivan, the Tsar's rage boiled over. His son had intervened after Ivan struck his pregnant daughter-in-law, causing her to miscarry. Father and son argued fiercely, their voices echoing through the palace. In fury, Ivan swung his iron-tipped staff and struck his son on the head. The young Tsarevich fell, blood spreading across the floor. Ivan's rage dissolved instantly into horror. He cradled his dying son, sobbing, begging forgiveness. But the wound was fatal. The heir of Russia was dead by his father's hand. This moment broke something irrevocable. Ivan was consumed by grief and guilt, his paranoia deepening further. The future of the dynasty grew uncertain for his surviving heir. The weak-minded Fyodor lacked strength to rule. The nation itself seemed to groan under the weight of his reign. In his final years, Ivan grew more erratic. He consulted astrologers fearing omens. He hoarded treasures suspicious of all around him. His health declined, plagued by gout and illness. Still, he clung to power, playing at governance even as energy failed him. On a March day in 15, while playing chess, he collapsed. Witnesses described him falling forward, his face suddenly pale, his breath failing. He died that evening, leaving behind a kingdom both expanded and traumatized. Ivan the Terrible's legacy is a paradox. He created institutions, codified laws, and opened Russia to trade and printing. He expanded its borders more than any ruler before him. Yet his reign also scarred the nation with terror, famine, and blood. He remains in Russian memory both as a defender of orthodoxy and as a tyrant whose name became synonymous with dread. In folklore, he appears as both hero and monster, reflecting the duality of his life. To historians, even demonstrates the danger of unchecked power fused with a tormented mind. His paranoia shaped the oprichnina. His grief fueled massacres. His anger destroyed his own heir. And yet he prayed, built churches, and dreamed of a Russia strong and united. He was all of these things at once, saint and sinner, reformer and butcher, conqueror and penitent. As the snow settles over Moscow's domes, and the echoes of his reign fade into silence, we drift away from Russia's frozen rivers. Our journey now turns south and west, across the Mediterranean to Constantinople, capital of Byzantium. There we meet another monarch, Justin II, whose mind too faltered beneath the crown, and whose delusions left his empire staggering. His tale, different yet familiar, awaits us in the next chapter. In the centuries that followed, Ivan's reign cast a long shadow. Russian rulers who came after him inherited not only the vast territories he had seized, but also the aura of fear and suspicion he had sown. In stories told by peasants beside winter fires, he was remembered as both protector and destroyer, the Tsar who crushed enemies, yet terrified his own people. Historians would argue for generations whether he was necessary for Russia's rise or whether his cruelty left wounds that never truly healed. And as snow continued to fall on Moscow's onion domes, the memory of Ivan the Terrible lingered like an echo, part prayer, part curse, always unresolved. From that silence we drift onward, leaving Russia's haunted palaces behind. Our journey now carries us south across seas and centuries to the fading grandeur of Byzantium, where Justin the would sit on the throne, another ruler whose mind betrayed him and whose empire trembled as he lost his grasp on reality. The city of Constantinople in the 6th century gleamed like no other. Its walls stretched mightily along the sea. Its markets teemed with goods from across the known world, and its churches glimmered with mosaics that caught the morning light. In this grand capital of Byzantium, successor to Rome, emperors ruled as gods chosen their crowns, symbols of heaven's mandate. In the year 565, after the death of the mighty Justinian, the throne passed to his nephew Justin II. It was a difficult inheritance. Justinian had built Hagia Sophia reconquered, swaths of the old Roman West, and codified laws in a way that shaped Europe for centuries. His shadow was long, his legacy monumental. For Justin to follow such a man was to walk beneath a weight almost impossible to bear. At first, Justin seemed determined to prove himself worthy. He sought to continue his uncle's grandeur, greeting ambassadors with ceremony, projecting confidence in court rituals, and presenting himself as a strong successor. His coronation was splendid, the palace halls filled with incense and chants, the imperial robes heavy with gold thread. The people cheered, hoping the empire would endure in strength. But beneath the glitter of the crown, cracks soon appeared. Justin inherited not only the throne, but also the empire's many burdens, wars on distant frontiers, a strained treasury, and deep religious divisions that split his people. The demands were immense, and the emperor, though ambitious, lacked the steadiness of character required. He grew restless, impulsive, and increasingly prone to erratic decisions. Early in his reign, he promised much. He declared himself a defender of orthodoxy, eager to heal schisms in the church. He spoke of justice, of securing the borders, of continuing Justinian's mission. Yet within a few years, his actions betrayed inconsistency. He alienated allies, lavished money the treasury could not spare, and embroiled the empire in fresh conflicts it could ill afford. The strain of these failures began to show in Justin's behavior. Courtiers noticed sudden mood swings, moments of eloquence and energy followed by bouts of rage or despair. He lashed out at advisors, accusing them of betrayal. At times, he burst into uncontrollable laughter even in solemn settings. At others, he raged so fiercely that servants trembled to approach him. Gradually, it became clear the emperor's mind was faltering. By the early 570s, Justin's illness grew undeniable. Chroniclers describe him screaming uncontrollably, biting attendants, and ordering executions in frenzies of paranoia. He saw enemies everywhere, Persians in shadows, traitors in his council, plots woven by unseen hands. At times, he refused food, convinced it was poisoned. At others, he gorged himself recklessly, only to collapse into despair. His nights were sleepless, filled with pacing and muttering. The empire, already strained, now groaned under a ruler unfit to govern. Wars with Persia intensified, draining men and gold. The Balkans, threatened by Avars and Slavs, saw raids and losses. Justin's inability to focus or lead left generals without direction, provinces without aid. Court officials struggled to conceal the emperor's madness, but rumors spread quickly, for subjects who believed the emperor embodied divine order. Such instability seemed like a crack in the very fabric of the world. Amid this decline, one figure rose to steady the empire, Empress Sophia, Justin's wife. Intelligent, resourceful, and politically astute, Sophia took a guiding hand. She managed court intrigues, arranged alliances, and sought capable advisors. Recognizing her husband's incapacity, she persuaded him to adopt a nephew Tiberius as Caesar in 574. In effect, Sophia and Tiberius governed in Justin's name, while the emperor himself receded into a shadow of madness. Justin's episodes grew more disturbing. Chroniclers describe him gnashing his teeth, staring blankly for hours, and even attempting to harm himself. His rages left attendants injured, while his terrors left him shivering, clutching at icons, begging for deliverance. Some said he believed demons haunted him, tormenting his mind. Others whispered that God's wrath had fallen upon him for the empire's sins. In public ceremonies, efforts were made to conceal his state, but often he could not control himself. One account describes him laughing hysterically through a solemn liturgy, his voice echoing wildly through Hagia Sophia as priests tried to continue their prayers. Another tells of him ordering musicians to play endlessly as if sound could drown the chaos in his head. As his illness deepened, he withdrew further into private chambers. Sophia and Tiberius shielded the empire from the worst of his instability, issuing decrees and leading armies in his stead. Yet the image of the emperor remained essential. His presence, however broken, still carried symbolic weight. Servants dressed him in imperial robes, placed the crown upon his head, and led him through rituals even when he could barely comprehend them. In 578, after 13 years on the throne, Justin's torment ended. He died in Constantinople, worn down by madness and illness. His reign had seen the empire weaken, its frontiers strained, its coffers depleted. He left behind little of glory, remembered more for his affliction than for any triumph, and yet in his story we glimpse the immense pressure of emperorship in Byzantium. To wear the diadem was to embody divine authority, to stand as God's chosen on earth. For a man of fragile mind, such weight could crush the spirit. Justin II became a symbol not of grandeur, but of fragility, an emperor who revealed that even in the mighty walls of Constantinople, human weakness could not be hidden. After his death, Empress Sophia continued to wield influence, while Tiberius became emperor. The empire staggered, unresilient, yet strained. But Justin's memory lingered as a warning that a crown could magnify a man's frailties as much as his strengths. For the people of Byzantium, the emperor's madness was both scandal and sorrow. Some saw it as divine punishment, others as proof of the devil's assault, still others as the inevitable breaking of a man crushed by impossible expectations. Whatever the cause, it left an imprint that could not be erased. As centuries passed, Justin II's reign was remembered among the cautionary tales of Byzantium. His name joined those of other rulers whose minds faltered, whose weakness imperiled the state. In the great tapestry of empire, he was a thread darkened by sorrow, yet essential in understanding the human cost of rule. And so, as our journey leaves the golden domes of Constantinople and the haunted shadow of Justin II, we drift once more into the wider medieval world. Ahead lies another monarch remembered with both fascination and dread. Rudolph II of the Holy Roman Empire, a Renaissance prince with glittering tastes and strange obsessions. He too would find his mind unraveling beneath the crown. His story, eccentric and tragic, awaits us in the next chapter. Justin II's life had always been lived in the shadow of greatness. His uncle Justinian had been one of the towering figures of Byzantine history. Justinian's reign brought monumental achievements, the reconquest of Italy and North Africa, the codification of Roman law, the construction of Hagia Sophia, that cathedral whose dome seemed to float upon light itself. When Justin inherited the throne in 565, he inherited not only the diadem, but also the burden of comparison. Courtiers measured him against his uncle from the very first day, and inevitably he fell short. Unlike Justinian, Justin II lacked patience and steadiness. He was described as energetic, quick to speak, but prone to temper and sudden shifts of mood. In his early months as emperor, he appeared determined to prove himself, to show that he too could command armies, oversee the church, and uphold the empire's grandeur. But beneath his confidence was a brittle spirit. He felt keenly the expectations pressing down upon him, and perhaps it was this inner pressure that cracked his composure. The empire he inherited was far from stable. Justinian's wars had drained the treasury. Though Hagia Sophia rose in brilliance and law codes shone with clarity, the coffers of the state were thin, and tax burdens weighed heavily upon the people. Outlying provinces smoldered with unrest. In Italy, the reconquest proved fragile. In North Africa, Berber tribes resisted Byzantine control. On the eastern frontier, the mighty Persian Empire under the Sassanids waited ever hostile. Justin II faced these problems with bold words, but poor strategy. He alienated allies through rash decisions, canceled subsidies to border tribes that had once bought peace, and insisted on costly ceremonies to emphasize his own majesty. The empire's gold, already thin, was scattered too freely. Even in Constantinople, merchants grumbled, while provincial governors wrote letters of alarm. Worse still were the empire's religious divisions. Justinian had tried with limited success to heal the schism between Chalcedonian Orthodoxy and Monophysite Christians. Justin declared himself a staunch defender of Chalcedonian Orthodoxy, but his uncompromising stance deepened resentment in provinces like Egypt and Syria, where many followed the Monophysite faith. Riots flared, churches split, and the emperor's proclamations carried more anger than reconciliation. It was against Persia that Justin's reign unraveled most dramatically. In 572, convinced that God favored his boldness, Justin launched war against the Sassanids. At first, his armies marched with confidence, but the campaign soon collapsed. The Persians struck back fiercely, overrunning Byzantine fortresses, burning cities, and capturing Dara, the great frontier stronghold. Defeat followed defeat, and soldiers returned home demoralized. Taxes rose to fund the war, but victories did not come. These failures weighed heavily on Justin, and here his fragility became plain. Chroniclers record that around this time his mind began to falter. At first, there were whispers of strange behavior, nervous laughter during solemn councils, shouting at shadows, bursts of incoherent speech. Courtiers tried to excuse these moments, but soon they could no longer be hidden. The emperor would sit for hours, staring blankly at walls, then leap up and rage against imaginary enemies. He accused servants of poisoning his food, ordering them beaten or driven away. He laughed uncontrollably in church, disrupting ceremonies with peals of mirth that frightened congregants. On other days, he raged so violently that attendants were bitten or struck. In moments of lucidity, Justin seemed aware of his decline. He begged for music to soothe him, ordering musicians to play endlessly in his chambers, perhaps hoping melody might calm the storm in his mind. But harmony could not heal what illness had taken. His instability became a matter of state, for in Byzantium, the emperor was not merely ruler, but symbol of divine order. If the emperor was broken, what did it mean for the empire? Sophia, his wife, stepped into the breach. Empress Sophia was no ordinary consort, intelligent, politically skilled, and ambitious. She assumed much of the responsibility for governance. She received envoys, managed finances, and counseled generals. In 574, recognizing Justin's incapacity, she persuaded him to adopt a capable commander, Tiberius, as Caesar. In this way, she preserved imperial dignity while ensuring the empire could function. Yet she had to tread carefully, for the fiction of Justin's authority still mattered. Meanwhile, Justin's decline continued. Chroniclers paint haunting scenes, the emperor shrieking through the palace, demanding invisible enemies be seized, the emperor gnawing at his own hands in frenzy, the emperor dragged back to bed by trembling attendants while Sophia watched with composed sorrow. Sometimes he calmed murmuring prayers, clutching icons as if begging for salvation. At other times he cursed heaven itself, despairing at his torment. For the people of Constantinople, rumors of his madness spread uneasily. In the hippodrome, charioteers still raced, factions still cheered, but whispers circulated. The emperor is not well. The emperor raves in his palace. The empire is in God's hands, alone. In markets and taverns, citizens debated whether Justin's illness was punishment for arrogance or simply the cruelty of fate. In the provinces, governors and generals bore the burden. The Persians pressed their advantage. The Balkans suffered raids, and Italy slipped further from Byzantine control. Sophia and Tiberius worked desperately to hold the empire together. They secured truces where they could shore up defenses and reassured subjects. Yet everyone knew the truth. Byzantium's emperor was a man lost in his own mind. In 578, Justin's long torment ended. He died in Constantinople after years of decline. His funeral was conducted with dignity imperial hymns, filling Hagia Sophia, but beneath the chant lay a sense of relief. The empire could move forward under Tiberius, guided by Sophia's steady hand. Justin II was remembered not for victories, not for monuments, but for madness. His reign became a cautionary tale of weakness at the summit of power. For historians, Justin II embodies the fragility of leadership in Byzantium. The emperor was expected to be God's representative, axis of the world, yet he was only human. When his mind faltered, the illusion cracked. His reign showed that no golden throne could shield a soul from illness, and that when the emperor failed, the empire trembled with him. And yet, in a quieter sense, Justin's story touches on compassion. He was not cruel like Ivan of Russia, nor violent like other tyrants. He was a man overwhelmed by burdens he could not carry, a ruler whose weakness revealed the heavy cost of expectation. His madness drew fear, but also pity, for in his brokenness, Byzantines glimpsed the frailty of all flesh, even crowned flesh. As centuries passed, Justin's name was listed among emperors who faltered his reign, a dark thread woven through the tapestry of Byzantine history. He is remembered less for what he did than for what he suffered, a reminder that thrones cannot erase human vulnerability. From the golden mosaics of Hagia Sophia, where priests once prayed for his healing, our journey drifts forward again, across the Alps and into the heart of Renaissance Europe. Another ruler awaits, Rudolph II of the Holy Roman Empire, brilliant in taste, eccentric in passion, yet haunted by delusions. Rudolph's court shimmered with art and science, even as his mind unraveled. His tale, strange and sorrowful, lies ahead. In the years after Justin II's death, Byzantines looked back on his reign with unease. Some chroniclers judged him harshly, recording only his madness and failures. Others spoke with pity, describing a man crushed by the legacy of Justinian and the burdens of empire. For ordinary people, his story became a reminder that even emperors could suffer as any man might pray to illness of body and spirit. In the candlelit chapels of Constantinople, priests prayed for his soul, while citizens whispered of the Empress Sophia's quiet strength that had saved the empire from collapse. Over time, Justin faded into the long list of emperors, remembered not for conquests or monuments, but for the fragility of his mind. His reign stood as a warning that crowns cannot cure sorrow, and power cannot shield a man from despair. From those gilded halls and fading mosaics, our path drifts north and west into the courts of Europe once more. There we shall meet Rudolph II, Holy Roman Emperor, whose brilliance as a patron of art was shadowed by delusions just as haunting. The year was 1576, when the imperial crown of the Holy Roman Empire passed to Rudolph II. Born in 1552, he was the son of Maximilian II, raised between the glittering courts of Vienna and the rigid discipline of Spain. From his youth, he seemed a figure touched by brilliance, intelligent, curious, and drawn to the mysteries of the world. When he inherited the empire, many hoped he would guide Central Europe into a new age of power and culture. In many ways, Rudolph fulfilled those hopes. His court in Prague became one of the great centers of the Renaissance. Painters, sculptors, alchemists, and astronomers gathered under his patronage. He welcomed masters like Giuseppe Arcimboldo, who painted fantastical portraits of fruits and flowers, and he invited the Danish astronomer Tycho Brahe, who charted the heavens alongside Johannes Kepler, who deciphered their mathematical laws. Cabinets of curiosities filled his palace, strange mineral, rare beasts, mechanical clocks that chimed with music, and globes that displayed a world growing wider by the year. To visitors, Rudolph's court seemed a wonderland, a place where art and science mingled under the protection of a visionary emperor. Yet beneath the splendor, unease stirred. For Rudolph himself was a man of contradictions, cultured yet reclusive, brilliant yet unstable. He withdrew more and more into the private world of his collections and studies, leaving governance neglected, the empire a patchwork of restless kingdoms and faiths, needed a steady hand. But Rudolph's mind began to drift elsewhere. He suffered bouts of melancholy that left him silent for days, refusing to see ministers. At other times, he erupted in fits of anger, alienating allies and frightening attendants. Whispers spread that the emperor's mind was fragile, that his brilliance came shadowed with madness. Courtiers grew cautious, never sure which Rudolph they would meet, the patron of genius or the brooding recluse. One of the strangest signs of his decline was the delusion that his body was made of glass. He feared that a touch, a stumble, even a loud voice might shatter him into pieces. To protect himself, he wore layers of padded clothing beneath his robes. Servants were ordered to walk softly, to speak in whispers, to avoid sudden movements that might break their emperor. The man who ruled vast realms believed himself as fragile as a vase on a shelf. This fear mirrored the fragility of his reign. While Rudolph collected wonders, Europe burned with division. The Reformation and Counter-Reformation had torn Christendom apart, and the Holy Roman Empire stood at the heart of these conflicts. Protestants and Catholics vied for dominance. Princes quarreled, and tensions simmered toward violence. Rudolph, instead of forging unity, retreated into solitude. He left decisions unanswered, edicts unsigned, problems unresolved. His courtiers despaired, for an empire without leadership was an empire drifting toward ruin. Still, Rudolph's patronage bore fruit. The sciences flourished in Prague. Kepler developed his laws of planetary motion. Brahe made meticulous observations, and artists created works that dazzled Europe. Alchemists crowded his palace, promising secrets of transmutation, elixirs of immortality, visions of hidden worlds. Rudolph delighted in such pursuits, pouring gold into laboratories and collections. To him, the mysteries of creation seemed more captivating than the disputes of parliaments or the needs of provinces. But his negligence came at a price. Revolts spread, foreign threats grew bolder, and imperial authority weakened. His own family turned against him, frustrated by his incapacity. His brother Matthias actually pressed claims to the throne, maneuvering to replace him. Court intrigue sharpened, and Rudolph, already distrustful, grew ever more paranoid. In his later years, Rudolph became a prisoner of his own fears. He locked himself in the castle at Prague, surrounded by treasures, but isolated from the world. Ministers waited in antechambers for days, uncertain if the emperor would grant audience. He ate irregularly, sometimes fasting in despair, other times indulging in heavy meals. His health failed, his moods darkened, and the empire slipped further from his grasp. By 1611, Rudolph had been forced to yield power to Matthias. The once brilliant emperor died the following year, alone among his collections, surrounded by relics and paintings that whispered of the man he might have been. History remembers Rudolph II as both a patron of genius and a ruler of weakness. Without him, Kepler and Brahe might not have flourished, and the art of Central Europe might not have glowed so brightly. Yet his inability to govern deepened divisions that would soon erupt into the 30 Years' War, one of the most devastating conflicts in European history. Rudolph's story is one of fragility disguised in splendor. He built a world of marvels, but could not master the world outside his palace. His delusions, his melancholy, his fear of shattering like glass, became symbols of an empire itself, fragile, ready to break under pressure. As we leave the halls of Prague, filled with wonders and shadows, we turn our gaze eastward once more. There, beyond the forests and mountains, rises the figure of Vlad, of Wallachia, known to history as Vlad, the Impaler. His tale is darker still, steeped in blood and cruelty, a story where fear was not delusion, but deliberate weapon. His chapter awaits grim and unforgettable. Rudolph II's early years were marked by displacement and discipline. Born in 1552 into the powerful Habsburg dynasty, he was the eldest surviving son of Maximilian. Yet unlike many heirs, raised in the relative warmth of their native courts, Rudolph spent much of his youth in Spain. Sent to the court of his uncle Philip, he grew up amid the strict somber rituals of the Spanish monarchy. There he encountered rigid Catholic piety, long hours of religious devotion, and the heavy atmosphere of a court that valued silence and obedience above laughter and light. Those years left their imprint. Rudolph absorbed Spain's taste for ceremony and secrecy, its suspicion of heresy, and its sense of imperial destiny. But he also absorbed its shadows, the melancholy, the isolation, the pressure of impossible expectations. When he returned to Vienna as a young man, he carried himself with dignity and caution, a prince both reserved and enigmatic. In 1576, at the death of his father, the imperial crown passed to him. He became Holy Roman Emperor, King of Hungary, King of Bohemia, and ruler of a vast patchwork of lands stretching across Central Europe. Expectations were high. The empire needed a steady hand to balance the quarrels of Protestants and Catholics, to check Ottoman advances in the East, and to hold together its fractious nobles. At first, Rudolph seemed equal to the task. His coronation was splendid, filled with jewels, banners, and choir, proclaiming him chosen by God. Yet from the start, he showed more interest in the private world of art and wonder than in the stern business of politics. Rudolph moved his court from Vienna to Prague, a decision that surprised many. In the Bohemian capital, he remade the city into a Renaissance jewel. Castles and gardens were filled with treasures, astronomical instruments, exotic animals, paintings of myth and allegory cabinets, of curiosities that overflowed with seashells, minerals, and mechanical marvels. Visitors spoke of marveling at lions pacing in cages, parrots squawking in winter snow fountains that spouted wine, and portraits that seemed both enchanting and unsettling. Prague, under Rudolph, became a magnet for talent. The painter Giuseppe Arcimboldo created whimsical likenesses of the emperor, composed entirely of fruits, vegetables, and flowers, images at once playful and unsettling. The astronomer Tycho Brahe brought his instruments to chart the heavens with unparalleled accuracy, while his pupil Johannes Kepler labored in Rudolph's service, eventually formulating the laws of planetary motion that still govern our understanding of the cosmos. Alchemists, mathematicians, poets, and musicians all found welcome in his halls. To many, Rudolph appeared a visionary, a patron who made his court a center of Europe's intellectual life. And yet, even as genius blossomed in Prague, cracks deepened in the empire's foundation. For while Rudolph collected wonders, he neglected governance. Imperial diets went unattended, petitions unanswered. The religious tensions that racked Europe between Protestants and Catholics, between reformers and defenders of tradition, boiled ever hotter. Princes demanded leadership, but Rudolph withdrew further into his private world. His personality grew increasingly difficult to navigate. He suffered from long bouts of melancholy, locking himself away in chambers lined with tapestries and curiosities. At times, he refused to bathe or cut his hair, living in near isolation while ministers waited outside for days, even weeks. He lashed out unpredictably, his temper alienating those who sought to help him. And then there were his delusions. Most infamous was his conviction that his body was made of glass. He feared that the slightest touch might shatter him. He ordered his clothes lined with heavy padding, forbade anyone from approaching too closely, and demanded silence in the palace corridors, lest sudden noise cause him to break. These fears, strange as they seemed, mirrored the fragility of his reign. The empire was like glass itself, vast and glittering, yet brittle, threatened by fractures from within and without. Religious strife spread across his domains. The Peace of Augsburg, which had sought to settle differences by allowing princes to choose their realm's faith, was unraveling. Protestants demanded further concessions. Catholics resisted fiercely, and Rudolph, paralyzed by indecision, failed to guide them toward compromise. Meanwhile, the Ottomans pressed at the empire's eastern borders. Battles in Hungary flared. Peasants groaned under taxes, and noble families maneuvered to protect their own power. Rudolph, instead of leading armies or forging alliances, obsessed over alchemical experiments. He longed for philosophers' stones and elixirs of life, convinced that hidden truths would reveal themselves in crucibles and retorts. Gold was poured into laboratories, even as soldiers went unpaid. The strain grew unbearable. His own family turned against him. His younger brother Matthias, frustrated by Rudolph's neglect, built support among nobles and clergy. One by one, territories shifted allegiance until Matthias openly challenged Rudolph for control. In the end, Rudolph was compelled to surrender much of his power, yielding Hungary, Austria, and eventually Bohemia. By his final years, Rudolph had become a prisoner in his own palace. He wandered among his collections, like a ghost caressing strange stones, gazing at paintings, or listening to musicians play in half-empty halls. He seldom emerged, seldom spoke to ministers, and seemed consumed by sadness. His health failed, gout tormented him, depression weighed heavily, and his mind unraveled further. He died in Sylph, largely isolated, leaving behind an empire weakened and divided. Within a few years, the 30 Years' War would erupt, plunging Europe into devastation. Many historians see Rudolph's failure to resolve religious tensions as one of the sparks that lit that terrible conflict. And yet, his legacy is not only of failure. The art and science he patronized transformed Europe. Without his support, Kepler might never have completed his laws, nor might the treasures of Prague have inspired generations. His collections laid the groundwork for the great museums of Vienna. His eccentricity, though destructive to governance, nurtured genius in others. Rudolph II remains a paradox. To some, he was a weak emperor undone by melancholy delusion and neglect. To others, he was a Renaissance prince whose passions enriched the world. His belief that he was made of glass may seem absurd, yet it speaks to the fragility of power itself. Even the mightiest emperor could imagine himself breakable, vulnerable, transparent before the weight of history. As night falls over Prague, and the stars Kepler charted wheel silently above, we drift from Rudolph's haunted court. Ahead lies another ruler remembered for fear rather than fragility, Vlad III of Wallachia, known to history as Vlad the Impaler. His story is one of cruelty wielded deliberately, where terror was not delusion but weapon. In his chapter, the shadows grow darker still. In his final years, Rudolph became a ghost within his own castle. The grand halls of Prague, once alive with banquets and lively debates, grew silent except for the shuffle of servants and the echo of musicians ordered to play endlessly for their emperor's comfort. Dust gathered on treasures in his cabinets of curiosities, rare shells glittering stones, mechanical clocks that ticked without audience. Lions still roared in cages outside, but their master seldom emerged to see them. Courtiers whispered of an emperor who wandered by lamplight through galleries at night, caressing canvases as if they were friends, or speaking softly to statues as though they might answer. For the scholars who had flourished under his patronage these years were bittersweet. Tycho Brahe, once the star of his court, died before seeing many of his projects completed. Johannes Kepler, left to carry on alone, worked amid uncertainty, grateful for Rudolph's earlier support, but aware that the empire itself teetered on the edge of collapse. In letters, Kepler described the court as brilliant but unstable, a palace of wonders standing on trembling ground. The emperor's neglect of politics left his scientists and artists vulnerable, their patronage tied to a man slipping ever deeper into melancholy. Among the common people, Rudolph's reputation was a strange blend of awe and unease. They marveled at the stories of exotic beasts, golden globes, and miraculous inventions that filled the castle. Yet they also pitied an emperor said to hide from sunlight, to pad his robes against shattering, to distrust his own flesh and bone. Some called him enlightened, a ruler of learning rather than war. Others muttered that he was bewitched, or cursed, or punished by heaven for turning away from the duties of a king. When he died in 16, his passing was met with both relief and sorrow. Nobles breathed easier, knowing the empire would now move under steadier hands. Scholars mourned the loss of a patron who, despite his flaws, had given them space to dream. History judged him harshly for his failures, his inability to manage religious strife, his passivity in the face of political crisis, his indulgence in alchemy while the empire unraveled. Yet history also preserved his gifts, the flowering of science, the expansion of art, the spark of imagination that made Prague, for a brief moment, one of the brightest courts of Europe. In the end, Rudolph the Thick remains a paradox remembered as both visionary and recluse, a monarch of brilliance and fragility. His delusions of glass were perhaps more than madness. They were a reflection of his world, an empire glittering yet brittle, dazzling yet breakable, and so his reign reminds us that power like glass can shine with beauty even as it edges toward fracture. From the hushed corridors of Prague Castle, we now drift into a very different world, one not of fragile visions, but of deliberate terror. Southward beyond the Carpathian Mountains lies Wallachia, where Vlad III carved his place in history. These fears known to us as dark, sharp. It is to his shadowed throne that we now turn. The land of Wallachia lay between mountains and rivers, a frontier realm caught between greater powers. To the north stretched Hungary, to the south the Ottoman Empire, to the east the Black Sea. In this borderland of shifting alliances and constant danger, princes rose and fell with dizzying speed. Among them was one who became legend, remembered not for mercy, but for terror. His name was Vlad III, son of Vlad Dracul, and history would call him Tepesh, the Impaler. Vlad was born in 1431 in the Transylvanian town of Sighișoara. His father, Vlad Dracul, belonged to the Order of the Dragon, sworn to defend Christendom against the Ottoman Turks. Yet loyalty in these borderlands was a fragile thing. Princes pledged allegiance to Hungary or to the Ottomans as necessity dictated, and betrayal was as common as fealty. From childhood, Vlad was immersed in a world where intrigue and violence shaped survival. When he was still a boy, his father sent him and his younger brother Radu as hostages to the Ottoman court, a pledge of loyalty to the Sultan. In Edirne, far from his native mountains, Vlad lived under the gaze of the Ottoman rulers. He learned their language, their customs, their military discipline. He witnessed their punishments, their executions, their relentless order. For years, he remained in captivity, his fate tied to his father's loyalty. When his father was assassinated in Wallachia and his elder brother buried alive, Vlad knew the fragility of life and the brutality of power. These lessons shaped him deeply. Released in 1448, Vlad returned to Wallachia to claim his throne. Yet his rule was contested, his position precarious. Again and again he lost and regained. Power exiled, restored, and exiled. Once more, through it all, he hardened into a ruler who trusted few and feared betrayal at every turn. To survive in Wallachia's brutal politics required ruthlessness, and Vlad embraced it with ferocity. When he secured the throne firmly in the 1450s, he set about remaking his principality. He strengthened fortresses, organized the army, and challenged the boyars Walachia's nobles who had murdered his family for treason, corruption, or even suspected disloyalty. He dealt punishment swiftly and brutally. His chosen method was impalement. Long wooden stakes, sharpened to points, were driven through bodies and raised upright, leaving victims to writhe in agony until death came. To his enemies, it was horror beyond comprehension. To Vlad, it was justice and deterrence. By spreading terror, he sought to make betrayal unthinkable. Chronicles speak of forests of stakes outside towns, their grisly occupants grim warnings to all. Merchants cheating in markets, thieves caught stealing boyars, suspected of treachery, all could find themselves impaled. His cruelty was infamous, but his authority grew. Wallachia, once fractured and vulnerable, now trembled under his iron hand. Crime diminished. Borders were defended. Even the Ottomans, vast in power, found him a dangerous foe. In 1462, when Sultan Mehmed II marched against him with a massive army, Vlad fought with savage cunning. He waged night raids, ambushed convoys, and spread panic. In one legendary episode, he left behind a field of thousands of impaled prisoners. The sight so horrified the Ottomans that even hardened soldiers recoiled. Yet his brutality was not indiscriminate. To some, he appeared as a harsh but fair ruler, one who punished corruption and defended his land. Peasants told stories of his fierce justice, of a golden cup left at a public fountain that no one dared steal, of a thief impaled for robbing travelers of order imposed where chaos once reigned. In an age when weakness meant ruin, Vlad's cruelty seemed to many the price of survival. Still, his methods alienated allies. Hungarian chronicles painted him as a monster, demonizing him in lurid tales. German pamphlets spread his reputation across Europe, describing banquets amid the impaled, cannibal feasts and atrocities that blurred fact with rumor. His name became legend, half history, half nightmare. By the late 1460s, Vlad's fortunes turned. Captured by Hungarian forces, he spent years in imprisonment, pacing in iron chains, awaiting the chance to reclaim his throne. In time he was released, restored once more to rule, but his final reign was short. In 1470 he fell in battle, fighting once again against the Ottomans. His body was mutilated, his head sent to Constantinople as proof of his death. Yet death did not end his power. Stories of Vlad spread across Europe, growing in the telling. To some, he was a hero, a Christian prince who defied the Turk. To others, he was a devil, a sadist whose cruelty defied imagination. In centuries to come, his legend inspired myths of vampires, feeding the creation of Count Dracula. For us, Vlad the Impaler remains a study in terror deliberately wielded. Unlike Charles of France or Henry of England, whose minds betrayed them, Vlad's cruelty was calculated, chosen a weapon of rule. He sought not only to punish, but to terrify, believing that fear could hold a fragile land together. As we leave the shadowed valley of Wallachia forest, whispering with tales of impalement, we reflect on the thin line between necessity and monstrosity. Was Vlad merely a product of his brutal age, or did he step beyond it into horror? His people endured under his harsh hand, his enemies recoiled, and his legend endured long after his bones had turned to dust. From the grim stakes of Wallachia, our path now turns westward once more. Beyond the Alps lies England, where the tale of King John, reviled in his own time and remembered as bad King John, reveals yet another side of terrible kingship. His reign marked not by madness or cruelty alone, but by incompetence and failure, shows how weakness too can be terrible. And so onward we drift to his troubled throne. Vlad's earliest years already carried the seeds of cruelty and cunning. Born in 1430, he grew up in a land torn between empires. Wallachia was no easy realm. Its princes ruled at the mercy of boyars at home and foreign powers abroad. Alliances with Hungary or with the Ottomans could shift in a season, and loyalty was as fragile as glass. Into this unstable world, Vlad was thrust while still a boy. In 1442, his father, Vlad the Dracul, was forced to give him and his younger brother Radu as hostages to the Ottoman Sultan. For several years, Vlad lived at Edirne, watching the workings of a power greater than anything he had known. The Ottomans taught disciplined horsemanship and military organization, but captivity also brought humiliation. He was far from home, aware that his life depended on his father's obedience. He learned the language of his captors, studied their customs, but never forgot he was a prisoner. His younger brother Radu adapted differently. Charismatic and handsome Radu earned favor at the Ottoman court, even converting to Islam and serving the Sultan loyally. Vlad, however, seethed with resentment. He bided his time, studying his captors, watching their punishments. The Ottomans often impaled rebels and traitors, leaving their bodies to rot as warnings. For the boy Vlad, these sights etched themselves deep into memory. Cruelty was not random, it was political theater, designed to control through terror. He would carry that lesson back to his homeland. When his father was betrayed and murdered by Wallachian boyars in 1447, and his elder brother buried alive, Vlad's distrust of the nobility hardened into hatred. Released by the Ottomans to serve their interests, he briefly seized the throne in 1448, but power slipped quickly from his grasp. Over the next years, he wandered between Hungary, Moldavia, and Transylvania, surviving in exile, sharpening his resolve. He would return, and when he did, he vowed never again to let boyars dictate his fate. By 1456, with support from Hungary, Vlad reclaimed the throne. This time, he ruled not as a pawn, but as a master. Immediately, he set about consolidating power. He rebuilt fortresses, recruited loyal soldiers, and imposed a code of justice, both feared and admired. For theft, corruption, and treason, he prescribed the stake. Boyar, who had betrayed his father, were invited to feasts, then executed or sent marching to build castles until they collapsed from exhaustion. Vlad was determined that no noble would dare plot against him again. Stories of his justice spread quickly. Peasants whispered of the golden cup left at a public well in Targoviste. So strict was his rule that none dared steal it. Merchants who once feared robbery on the roads found safety under his harsh punishments. To ordinary folk, Vlad seemed a ruler who cared less for privilege than for order. To nobles and enemies, he was a nightmare. His most infamous acts came during his struggle against the Ottoman Empire. In 1462, Sultan Mehmed II marched north with an army said to number more than 100,000 men, determined to crush the Wallachian prince. Vlad, facing overwhelming odds, turned to terror as his weapon. He launched night raids, striking camps and slipping away into forests. But his most shocking gesture was the forest of the impaled. Near Targoviste, the Sultan and his men came upon thousands of stakes, each bearing the body of an Ottoman prisoner. The grotesque sight stretched across the fields a landscape of death designed to unnerve. Hardened soldiers faltered, shaken by the scale of horror. The campaign devastated Wallachia. Though Vlad fought with cunning, his people paid the price. Villages burned fields, ravaged families torn apart. Ultimately, Mehmed withdrew, but Vlad's position weakened. His brother Radu, supported by the Ottomans, seized power. Vlad fled seeking aid from Hungary, only to be betrayed and imprisoned by King Matthias Corvinus. For over a decade, Vlad languished in captivity. In the dungeons and halls of Hungary, he brooded, prayed, and perhaps softened in some ways. Chronicles say he eventually married and converted formally to Catholicism, hoping to prove his loyalty to Christian Europe. Yet he never abandoned his thirst to rule again. When circumstances shifted in the 1470s, Hungary released him, and once more he marched to reclaim Wallachia. His final reign was brief. In 876, he fell in battle against the Ottomans. His body mutilated, his head sent to Istanbul as proof of death. His enemies rejoiced, his supporters mourned, but all agreed his life had been one of ferocity unmatched. The legacy of Vlad III is complex. In Wallachia, peasants remembered him as a harsh but just ruler, a prince who punished corruption and defended the land. To enemies, he was a demon, his name whispered with horror. Across Europe, pamphlets spread lurid tales of impalements, of boiling and skinning, of banquets amid corpses. Some stories were exaggerated propaganda, others true. Altogether, they built an image of a man who embodied terror itself. Centuries later, his legend mingled with folklore to inspire the fictional vampire Count Dracula. The real Vlad was no creature of the night, but the association endures a testament to the power of his legend. He became a symbol of cruelty, of the thin line between justice and monstrosity, of how rulers in desperate times might wield fear as their sharpest sword. For us, Vlad the Impaler's story differs from the kings undone by madness or weakness. He was not fragile like Charles, nor gentle like Henry VI, nor eccentric like Rudolph II. His terribleness lay in choice. He chose cruelty as policy, terror as instrument, horror as his legacy. Whether necessary or excessive, it bound his realm for a time, and it bound his name forever to fear. As we drift away from the bloodied stakes of Wallachia, the forests shrouded in mist, we prepare for the final tale in our journey. Across the sea in England, another king waits reviled, not for brutality, but for incompetence. No known as Bad King John. His reign reminds us that failure too can be terrible, and that not all haunted thrones are stained with blood. Some crumble instead under weakness and folly. Long after Vlad's death, his memory lingered in curious duality. In the villages of Wallachia and Transylvania, peasants told stories of him with a strange respect. They whispered of the prince who punished thieves so thoroughly that a golden cup could rest untouched at a well. They recalled how merchants traveled safely along roads once plagued by bandits, and how justice, though brutal, was applied without regard to noble privilege. For them, Vlad was remembered as a ruler who defended the land against corruption within and enemies without. Some ballad even painted him as a national hero, a man who stood fearlessly against the Ottoman tide. In the courts of Europe, however, his reputation darkened into myth. German pamphleteers eager to smear him circulated lurid tales of excess feasts among impaled corpses, fountains running with blood cruelty so grotesque it blurred fact and fantasy. Hungarian chroniclers cast him as a fiend, a wild beast barely human. These accounts spread far, making Vlad a figure of horror across Christendom. He became less a man and more a symbol, the cruel tyrant, the nightmare prince. Centuries later, when Gothic imagination took hold in Western Europe, these fragments of legend became fertile ground. Writers seeking dark inspiration looked to the east, to tales of a Wallachian prince who drank blood and ruled with terror. Out of these seeds grew Bram Stoker's Dracula, a creature of fiction, yet rooted faintly in the shadow of Vlad Tepes. The vampire count bore little resemblance to the real prince, yet the association stuck. Through literature and film, Vlad's name gained an immortality stranger than history, not as ruler or warrior, but as monster of the night. Still, historians return to the man behind the myth. They find a ruler shaped by betrayal, captivity, and war. A man who chose terror not out of madness, but out of conviction, believing it the only way to hold a fragile realm together. His reign was brief, his methods cruel, but his impact enduring. He forces us to ask unsettling questions. Can fear truly bind a people? And if so, at what cost? As the mists close over Wallachia, we drift onward, leaving behind forests filled with grim stakes and legends that still chill the imagination. Our journey now crosses the sea to England, where another king awaits. He wielded no forests of impalement, no night raids against mighty sultans dead. His terribleness lay in weakness, folly, and failure, known to history as Bad King John. His reign shows that incompetence, too, can be as destructive as cruelty. And so we turn softly and steadily to the troubled throne of England. England at the dawn of the 13th century was a kingdom of rolling green fields, bustling market towns, and castles of grey stone rising above rivers and forests. The memory of strong rulers still hung in the air. Henry VIII, who had forged a mighty Angevin empire, and Richard the Lionheart, who rode with crusading zeal across the seas. Yet when the crown passed in 1199 to Richard's younger brother John, the fortunes of England began to falter. Where Richard was remembered as bold, John became infamous as weak, treacherous, and inept. He would be remembered in history not as the great or the brave, but as Bad King John. John's early years gave little promise of greatness. Born in the youngest of Henry's 5 sons, he was not expected to inherit the throne. His father amused nicknamed him John Lackland, for unlike his elder brothers, he was not granted a great dukedom or county, yet through a tangle of deaths and shifting fortunes, John ascended the throne. When Richard died without heirs in 1199, the crown that had seemed out of reach was suddenly his. At first, John seemed determined to rule well. He inherited vast lands, England itself, along with Normandy, Anjou, and Aquitaine on the continent. The Angevin Empire stretched from the Scottish border to the Pyrenees, a realm rivaling any in Europe. But holding such lands required strength of character, and in this John was lacking. His first great failure came swiftly, the loss of Normandy. Richard had fought fiercely to hold the duchy, but John's poor leadership and mistrust of allies allowed the French king Philip V to strike decisively. By 1204, Normandy was lost to France, a blow that shattered the Angevin Empire. Nobles grumbled that John had squandered their heritage while French power grew stronger. Worse than his military failures were his personal flaws. John was notoriously suspicious, quick to anger, and vindictive in punishment. He quarreled with barons, confiscated lands, and demanded excessive taxes. He developed a reputation for cruelty, imprisoning opponents, and even starving prisoners to death. His treatment of noble families bred resentment that would one day rise against him. Even the church found him intolerable. When the Archbishop of Canterbury died in 1205, a dispute over his successor erupted between John and the Pope. John refused to accept the papal choice, Stephen Langton, and the quarrel escalated until Pope Innocent III placed England under interdict in 1208. Churches closed, sacraments were denied, and the kingdom was cast into spiritual crisis. John was excommunicated, his very soul declared cut off from the church. For an age when faith permeated every aspect of life, this was catastrophe. John eventually submitted, bowing to papal authority and even offering England itself as a papal fief, paying tribute to Rome. This humiliation further tarnished his standing at home. Nobles muttered that their king had bent the knee not to God, but to foreign priests. Yet John was not idle. He schemed constantly, raising funds to reclaim his lost lands in France. Taxes grew heavier, levies more frequent. Merchants, peasants, and nobles alike felt the burden. In 1214, John led a campaign to recover Normandy, but at the Battle of Bouvines, he was decisively defeated. The dream of restoring Angevin glory died on that field. It was the breaking point. English barons, weary of his failures and exactions, rose in rebellion. In 1215, they confronted him at Runnymede, a meadow by the Thames, and forced him to seal a document that would echo through the centuries, Magna Carta. This great charter sought to limit the king's power, to affirm that even the sovereign was bound by law. John, ever slippery, never intended to honor it. He appealed to the Pope, who annulled the charter, declaring it void. Civil war erupted. The barons invited Prince Louis of France to claim the English throne. John fought desperately, but his fortunes continued to sour. In October 1216, amid the turmoil, John fell ill with dysentery while campaigning. He died at Newark Castle at the age of 50, leaving his 9-year-old son, Henry III, to inherit the crown. England was weary of war, weary of failure, and weary of John. John's legacy was one of contradiction. He was cunning, shrewd in administration, capable of raising armies and squeezing taxes, but he lacked the charisma, loyalty, and steadiness that bound men to great kings. He alienated his barons, angered the church, lost his continental empire, and left behind a realm in chaos. Yet from his failures came something greater. Magna Carta, though annulled and reissued in altered form, became a cornerstone of English liberty. It affirmed principles that would echo far beyond his reign, that kings were not above the law, that subjects had rights, that governance required consent as well as command. Ironically, John's incompetence birthed an ideal that would shape democracy itself. For this reason, John remains both infamous and strangely important. He was terrible as a king, but his terribleness changed history. His reign shows that weakness can be as destructive as cruelty, that folly can reshape nations as surely as conquest. He stands at the close of our journey as a reminder that not all haunted crowns are soaked in blood. Some crumble under the weight of failure. As the bells of medieval England toll softly in the distance, we leave bad King John to his troubled rest. Our journey through terrible kings has shown us madness, cruelty, delusion, and weakness. Each story reveals not only the perils of power, but also the fragility of the human mind. From France to Russia, from Byzantium to England, we have drifted through the haunted thrones of history, and now with gentle breath, we let their shadows fade, carrying only the quiet lessons of their sorrow into the realm of sleep. John's character, more than his circumstances, shaped the course of his reign. Chroniclers describe him as clever and quick-witted, able to speak persuasively when he chose. Yet these qualities were clouded by darker traits: jealousy, suspicion, and cruelty. He was prone to sudden bursts of rage, punishing servants or courtiers harshly for small slights. He had a talent for administration. He kept detailed records, managed revenues carefully, but his talents were undermined by a vindictive nature. Nobles distrusted him, for he rarely forgave an enemy and seldom kept faith even with allies. His personal life added to his reputation for treachery. John was notorious for pursuing the wives and daughters of his barons, sometimes by seduction, sometimes by force. Such actions earned him bitter enmity from the very men whose loyalty he most needed. The chronicles tell of lords who turned against him, not merely for political reasons, but for personal revenge. The court of England, instead of loyalty, seethed with resentment, and John seemed unable or unwilling to restrain himself. In his dealings with his family, John was equally troubled. His elder brother Richard had been lionized as a crusading hero, and John's succession was overshadowed by comparison to his nephew Arthur of Brittany, a rival claimant supported by many in France. John showed ruthless cruelty. Captured after battle, the young Arthur disappeared into John's custody in 1203. Rumors spread that John himself had murdered the boy, perhaps with his own hands. Though the truth was never proven, the suspicion clung to him further, darkening his reputation. The great catastrophe of his reign remained the loss of Normandy and the Angevin Empire in France. These lands had been the jewel of the Plantagenet crown, hard won by his ancestors. John's military blunders, compounded by his mistrust of capable commanders, led to swift defeat at the hands of King Philip of France. Normandy fell, followed by Anjou and much of Aquitaine. English nobles who held estates on both sides of the Channel now saw their continental lands vanish. Resentment deepened. John had squandered the inheritance of a dynasty. To recoup his losses, John turned to taxation. He extracted unprecedented sums through scutage, a payment in lieu of military service, and through arbitrary fines. Merchants, clergy, and commoners alike groaned under the burden. John's exchequer grew rich, but his people grew bitter. Stories spread of the king demanding money at whim, selling justice to the highest bidder, or seizing property outright. He became a monarch, feared not for majesty, but for avarice. His quarrel with the church deepened this resentment. When he refused to accept Stephen Langton as Archbishop of Canterbury, Pope Innocent III struck back with an interdict in 1208. For 6 long years, the kingdom lived under shadow. Bells were silenced, churches closed, marriages performed without blessing, burials without sacred rites. The people believed their souls imperiled, their land cursed. John excommunicated, lashed out at clergy seizing church lands and wealth. Only in 1213, faced with invasion threats, did he relent dramatically, submitting to the Pope and offering England itself as a papal fief. To his enemies at home, this act looked like surrender, a king giving away his kingdom to save himself. The climax of John's reign came with his disastrous attempt to recover Normandy. In 1214, he led a grand campaign, mustering English forces and allies. But at the Battle of Bouvines, his coalition collapsed. The French under Philip then won a decisive victory, leaving John humiliated and England isolated. His barons, weary of taxation and failure, returned home furious. They had paid dearly for nothing. Rebellion followed. The barons rose against him, demanding reforms and guarantees. At Runnymede, in June 1215, beside the slow waters of the Thames, John was forced to meet them. Surrounded by knights and banners, he sealed Magna Carta, the Great Charter. Its clauses spoke of liberties, protection from arbitrary imprisonment, limits on taxation, respect for the rights of the church and towns. For the first time, a king of England acknowledged that his power was not absolute. Yet John had no intention of keeping his word. No sooner was the ink dry than he sought papal annulment. Pope Innocent obliged declaring Magna Carta void, calling it an insult to royal authority. John, emboldened, resumed the war. The realm descended into civil strife, known as the First Barons' War. The rebels, desperate, invited Prince Louis of France to claim the English throne. French forces landed, and John found himself fighting not only his barons, but a foreign invader. The struggle might have destroyed the kingdom entirely, but fate intervened. In October 1216, campaigning in the east, John contracted dysentery. Weakened and despairing, he staggered from castle to castle. Chroniclers tell of him losing the crown jewels in the treacherous tides of the Wash, a symbol of his reign slipping away. On October 19th, 1216, at Newark Castle, he died aged 50. His 9-year-old son, Henry III, inherited the throne while the kingdom reeled from war. John's death ended the immediate crisis. Many barons unwilling to serve a French prince rallied to young Henry. Magna Carta was reissued this time, with papal approval, beginning its journey from a failed peace treaty to a cornerstone of constitutional government. Ironically, the very charter John despised became his most lasting legacy. How then should we remember bad King John? Medieval chroniclers were harsh. Roger of Wendover called him a tyrant rather than a king. Matthew Paris painted him as faithless, cruel, and cowardly. The common people cursed his heavy taxes and his quarrels with the church. Even Shakespeare, centuries later, depicted him as weak and treacherous. Few monarchs have suffered such consistently dark portrayals. Yet history is rarely so simple. Some modern scholars note his administrative skill, his keen eye for record keeping, his ability to raise resources unmatched by earlier kings. Without John's financial systems, later Plantagenets might not have wielded such strength, but these small virtues could not outweigh his failings. He alienated allies, squandered lands, provoked rebellion, and left his kingdom fractured. He was not terrible by madness, like Charles, nor by cruelty calculated like Vlad, but by incompetence and spite. In the centuries that followed, Magna Carta grew in stature. It was cited by rebels, reformers, and statesmen as proof that even monarchs must obey the law. From England to America, its spirit inspired the growth of liberty, and so paradoxically, John's reign, so despised in his own time, sowed seeds of freedom for generations unborn. To school children, He is still remembered as the villain in the tales of Robin Hood, the greedy king who oppressed the poor while the noble outlaw resisted. In popular imagination, he stands forever as Bad King John, a name that needs no explanation. His terribleness was not glorious, not heroic, not even dramatic, but petty, mean-spirited, and enduring. As our journey closes, we leave John in his tomb at Worcester Cathedral, where monks once prayed for the soul of a man few loved. His reign reminds us that weakness can wound as deeply as cruelty, and folly can change history as surely as triumph. From France to England, from Russia to Byzantium, from the high halls of emperors to the shadowed valleys of Wallachia, we have walked among terrible kings. Some were broken by madness, some consumed by paranoia, some drunk on blood, others undone by failure. Each wore a crown, yet each revealed the fragile humanity beneath. Their stories, though dark, shimmer with lessons still. And so, dear listener, as you drift toward rest, let these tales fade into dream. For in the end, even the mightiest monarchs were but men, their crowns unable to shield them from fear, folly, or fate. Over time, John's memory passed into legend. In church chronicles, he remained the excommunicate king, faithless and cruel. In baronial records, he was the oath breaker, the monarch who could not be trusted. In the songs of later centuries, he became the foil to Robin Hood, the greedy ruler whose taxes and tyranny gave rise to an outlaw hero. His figure shifted from history into folklore, a cautionary tale retold around firesides and in plays. Few kings were so consistently condemned, their names a byword for failure. Yet in this darkness lies a subtle reminder. Not every terrible king was monstrous in cruelty or lost in madness. Some were terrible in smaller, more human ways, in jealousy, in weakness, in short-sightedness. John's reign teaches us that folly can wound as much as steel, and mistrust can unravel kingdoms as surely as battle. As we close his story, we see the crown resting not on a mighty conqueror, nor on a mad tyrant, but on a man too flawed to carry its weight. His failures gave birth to Magna Carta. His weakness carved a path to liberty. Such is history's paradox, that from bad kings, good legacies may yet arise. And now, dear listener, we drift toward our closing reflections, where all the haunted thrones we have visited will gather into one quiet lesson for the night. Our journey has carried us through a gallery of troubled thrones, 8 kings whose reigns revealed the shadows beneath the crown. We saw Charles the Sixth of France, once beloved, descend into madness after a firelit masquerade. We drifted through the gentle sorrow of Henry the Sixth of England, a soul too fragile for a brutal age. We traced the brilliance and ruin of Eric VIII of Sweden, undone by paranoia, and we watched Ivan the Terrible of Russia wield cruelty as a weapon until it consumed even his own son. In Byzantium, Justin the Second taught us how the weight of empire could break a mind, while Rudolph II of the Holy Roman Empire revealed the fragility of a ruler who imagined himself made of glass. In Wallachia, Vlad the Impaler ruled not through love, but through terror, his forests of stakes haunting memory and myth. And finally, in England, bad King John showed us how incompetence, suspicion, and failure could wound a realm as surely as bloodshed. Each story, though centuries old, speaks softly to us even now. They remind us that rulers are human, susceptible to fear, folly, cruelty, and despair. Absolute power did not shield them from weakness. Indeed, it often magnified it. Yet from their failures came lessons, Magna Carta's promise of liberty, Kepler's laws of motion, the resilience of nations tested by turmoil. So as the echoes of their reigns fade into silence, let us drift into rest with a quiet truth. Even in history's darkest chapters, we find both warning and wonder, for the crown may glitter, but beneath it beats only the human heart, fragile, yearning, and mortal.